because this might be the inner chronicle of what we are. And we have to articulate ourselves, otherwise we would be cows in a field.
Welcome to Cows in the Field. This is a show in which we discuss philosophical themes in popular films. My name is Justin.
I'm Laura.
Today we kick off our miniseries on Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy with 2001's The Fellowship of the Ring. The beginning of a hero's journey and our introduction to the realm of Middle-earth. And we're very excited to welcome as guests two big fans of the books and films. Our first guest is a PhD student in philosophy at MIT. Welcome, Bennett Eckert.
Hello. Thank you.
And our second guest is a PhD student in East Asian languages and literatures at Yale and the author of 3 novels, The Poppy War, The Dragon Republic, and the recently released Babel. Welcome, Rebecca Kuang.
Thanks for having us.
So thanks for coming on, you guys. This has been, I think in a way, a long time coming. I didn't realize, actually, I'm going to put you on the spot, but I didn't realize that when you had suggested Spider-Man 2, were you volunteering to come on for Spider-Man 2?
I was. And I was very hurt when you had someone else on.
Oh no.
I listened to that podcast and it was a lot of fun, but I simply felt that you all did not appreciate the film as much as I would have.
Well, hopefully we can remedy that today with Lord of the Rings. So now you guys, we're doing the whole mini-series, and we're really happy to have you guys kick it off. And I think really we couldn't kick it off with anyone better because, both of you are fantasy, big into fantasy, I would say, right? Was that correct?
I would say so.
Yes.
I mean, more her, because she writes them too.
Yes.
It's fantasy because I write them.
That is important. I think for me, this movie was really, I think, a watershed moment, I think, actually. And so I'm curious for you guys, when was the first time you saw the film? Did you see it in theaters? And were you at all nervous going in? Because, there was a lot riding on this movie's shoulders, being an adaptation of one of the most famous and important pieces of fantasy literature. And then how did you feel about it when you left the theater or screening room or wherever you saw it?
Ha ha ha.
You should answer first.
We are so young. I would have been 5 when it came out in theaters, so I have no memory of seeing it in theaters.
I see.
But
Okay.
my parents were really, really into it, so I don't know when I first saw it all the way through because it was one of those films that was just on in the background all the time during my childhood. So if the TV was on, Frodo and Sam were talking, or orcs were being demolished. So it's not until college that I sat down and watched the whole trilogy through and I understood the sequencing of events and understood fully the entire plot. But it's one of those movies that feels like it's just always been with me, like the Bible, which is not a movie, but a story that has been with me since I was sentient. But actually, a few months ago, we were doing a rewatch and I was like, wow, these movies are so good. I really want to talk to people about it. So I asked a lot of people on Twitter, what was it like watching The Return of the King come out in theaters? What was the energy? I really wish I could have been there for that cultural moment. And people were like, we were screaming, we were crying, we were frothing at the mouth. We were cheering when Eowyn kills the Witch King. And someone said that the best part of seeing Fellowship come out in theaters way back when is knowing that the adaptation had been done so well and that there were 2 more films of this to come. So we missed out on that cultural landmark, but I really...
Rebecca, had you read the book before you saw the film?
No.
Okay. And for you, Ben, it was...
You couldn't read.
Oh, okay. So you saw the film before
5.
you... Well, no, but you saw it before you could read?
Well, the reason for hesitation is because I think I saw the films and read the book concurrently because we had this giant load of, it was all in one volume and it was too big for my hands to carry. So I ripped it into chunks and would read them out of order. Because I would read in the bathtub and read it outside. So I'd read all these chunks that were my favorite parts based on who my favorite characters were. So I was just Lord of the Rings this one long story and I have a lot of scenes from it, but I have no
Yeah.
understanding of how it works structurally or thematically until I went back and read it and watched it as
Got
an
it.
adult.
Yeah, that's like how you like to read, Laura, right? Laura destroys her books, and it totally like aggravates me. I'm like, oh
We
my god,
can't
this thing
share
is a
books.
precious object. And,
Yeah, I'm just like, if you didn't break the back of that book, did you even enjoy it?
oh my
That's
god,
That's how I write in my books. So I like really.
yeah. Justin's has to be.
This is how I do
pristine.
with books. It's these. I don't know if you can see this. These
Yeah,
are
it's a little-
sticky notes because I don't
Oh
want to
my
write and
gosh.
destroy the book because I might sell it later. You never know.
Yeah, it seems like a joyless way to do it, but sure.
Wait, so Laura, did you even see this? Like, this was not on your radar.
No, I saw them all in theaters. I think.
Okay,
I think I remember. Oh
but
my
you never read the book.
No, I read The Hobbit when my dad read to me when I was little, and he read The Hobbit, and then we tried Lord of the Rings and very quickly just couldn't do it. I remember, I think I went to all of them in theaters. I
Yeah.
remember like going with my teenage friends to Return of the King. I like
Okay, yeah.
weirdly I can remember that somebody's cell phone broke or something more than I can remember the movie itself.
Yeah, you're like it was long.
But I think, I mean, yeah, it was something you had to go to. Because we were that age. I think I was 14 when the movie came out. The first one came out, Fellowship.
Mhm.
Trying to think.
Yeah, so I'm the old man here because
Yeah.
I mean, these movies were like, there was like a lot riding on it for me. And not because I had like a big thing with Lord of the Rings in particular, but because I was really into fantasy as a young kid and a teenager. So I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons. This was like, unsurprisingly, if you've listened to this podcast, you're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. This guy was like a little troll playing Dungeons and Dragons, mostly by myself because I couldn't convince any of my friends to play Dungeons and Dragons. So it quickly became like a social pariah thing to do. So I would be by myself in my room, like imagining what it would be like to play Dungeons and Dragons with people and then never really getting to do it. Laura's laughing at me. Which is not how you should play Dungeons and Dragons. But anyway, it's a very social game, by the way. But Dungeons and Dragons is like all this fantasy and and all the lore, right? Guy Jacks took all the lore and stuff from Lord of the Rings. So when we're like gearing up for Lord of the Rings, my dad's like, oh, you should read the books and stuff. So I was reading them and feeling like, oh yeah, this is very familiar.
Right.
It's totally like all the breakdown of the races and everything is familiar. But then there's actually a lot of stuff that's quite different. And aspects of Dungeons and Dragons, actually, some of them are closer to things like Harry Potter than Lord of the Rings. It's something maybe we can talk a little bit about because I actually find it kind of interesting how the fantasy worlds, how the structure, the power structure, and the deity structures are different. But anyway, I was into D&D, and these movies came out probably when I was just I was in high school. I was about to graduate, and I mean, they were amazing. I was really blown away by them, and I think they came out around the same time as Harry Potter. Like these movies
definitely
come
did,
out
yes.
almost concurrently. I saw them both in theaters, and I was like, "Yeah, it's Harry Potter." I was like, "That's
How dare
garbage
you.
for children, right?" And then Lord of the Rings is the real deal.
I will say the first movies both have trolls, and one troll looks terrible in Harry Potter, and this troll looks pretty solid.
Yeah. So I was obvious, but I was 17, right? I was like, this obviously I was going to be into Lord of the Rings over Harry Potter. And so, and as you said, Rebecca, I mean, they held up. And yeah, I saw all three in theaters, and I don't remember it being like an endgame moment in Return of the King. It probably was, with the like picking up the hammer or whatever, people screaming but I just remember feeling incredibly satisfied. And honestly, I felt optimistic because I was thinking not that like this is the best fantasy film ever made and will ever be made. I was thinking, wow, this is what the promise of great fantasy is going to be, right? This is where we have the technology now. We're just going to see tons of these movies. And then it just didn't happen. And that's something we'll get into later. It's like, why didn't that happen? Why haven't there been as many amazing fantasy movies and adaptations? But so I think we all had similar experiences, though at very different life stages.
Well, mine was almost the opposite.
Okay.
I did not see it until I was 19. And I saw it in college in I think 2018 with Rebecca because we were trading our favorite film trilogies,
Okay.
which neither of us had seen. So I made her watch the Dark Knight trilogy, and she made me watch this. And I was like, I had basically no context except that this was like a significant cultural thing. And I watched Fellowship, and I was like, I don't really get it. This is not like a whole movie. And then we watched the next two nights, and I was like, oh, these are amazing. So when I went back and watched Fellowship again, I was like, this is significantly better than it seemed like it was the first
Yeah.
time.
Mm-hmm.
But it like had no role in my early childhood, and I had like no expectation.
That's so crazy. I remember I took art class in 9th grade. I remember this one girl just like couldn't stop drawing Legolas. Just couldn't stop drawing
so
him. Like
you
it
guys
was like
missed out on
everywhere,
the
guys.
that was definitely a thing, and that was annoying. But Bennett, I'm curious, had you read or seen the Harry Potter movies prior to?
For sure.
Okay.
I'd read and seen all of them.
So I'm curious, coming from the Harry Potter universe, were you like, oh, this Lord of the Rings stuff is so much better in every way, or were there aspects of it where you actually thought, I actually prefer the way Harry Potter's handling it?
So I don't think I ever thought of them as super comparable, because I always thought of Harry Potter as this kind of like school story, and they're people that I could ostensibly be. And Lord of the Rings I thought of as this just like grand, otherworldly adventure. I do think by the end of Return of the King, I was like, Harry Potter is kind of cute and fun, but the Lord of the Rings is like epic and meaningful and thematically interesting. So in that sense, I'm much more likely to revisit it any given time, and I think it's significantly better. And I think I did kind of immediately once I saw it.
The reason I ask is, so this is the thing I was meaning about how, I don't know, the mystical structure of Lord of the Rings is very different from Dungeons and Dragons and also Harry Potter. So like magic, for instance, which plays a major role in these different worlds, is handled very differently. So in Harry Potter, they're like, I guess the way it works is if you have a certain bloodline, you have certain magical abilities, but they have to be, you can practice and hone them and so on. But magic in and that's how it is in Dungeons and Dragons, basically. I mean, basically, if you train, you can be a wizard. And then there's certain people who have like sorcerers that have kind of ingrained magical power, but it's sort of like accessible to anyone in principle. But in Lord of the Rings, magic is very limited and minimal in a way. Like in the actual Lord of the Rings series, there's no dragons, for instance. You see orcs that they're basically these creatures that have been forged magically, I suppose, through like torture or whatever. And then Gandalf doesn't do that much, like especially in this film in Fellowship. He's got the staff and he walks around and he does various things, but he's not like apparating and
apparating. That drove you crazy when you're reading the Harry Potter books. You're like, why doesn't everybody just apparate everywhere?
Yeah, for sure.
Once you got that power, why are you walking anywhere? I know in the scene where they all have to jump over the broken staircase in the mine, I was just like, well, why are they all jumping?
Why can't
he
you
just
fly?
magic a staircase there or something? Like I was like, what does Gandalf do?
Like, what are the limitations of his power? It's not clear, right?
Yeah.
Especially in the movies. I haven't reread the books in a long time, but it's not totally clear what his power set is. Whereas in Harry Potter, I feel like you get a pretty good sense of like what different people can do.
I think that's wrong.
Okay.
Tell us.
Everything you have just said about magic. I think the difference is not that there's a lot of magic in Harry Potter and less magic in Lord of the Rings, because magic underlies every significant plot of it. I mean, the ring itself is magic. The existence of all the rings of power, they're magic. In Fellowship, when Arwen's chanting to bring like the horses in the river, that's magic. The Witch Kings, like literally their entire existence is magic. Lothlorien, Galadriel's mirror, when she speaks to them through her mind. There's a ton of magic throughout the entire trilogy. I think the difference is that Harry Potter makes it very organized and neat and twee, so that, you just say this word and you get this exact magical effect. But in Lord of the Rings, magic is like an element and it underwrites every like facet of existence, and it's not perfectly understood because it's not like people are learning this as a craft, but magical ability is an inherent part of like the beings that they are. And we were actually talking earlier today about how it's very interesting that we never learned the magical limitations of the ring itself. The only magical powers that the ring ever displays throughout the trilogy are first turning the wearer invisible and second giving them immortal life, neither of which are traits that are that intimidating or would come to mind when you think of abilities that would help someone take over entire realms. And it's more frightening that we don't know the true extent of the ring's power. There's all this magic that's unsaid, that is mysterious, that is ineffable. And that's what, to me, makes Lord of the Rings more interesting and adult and complicated than Harry Potter, where magic's like you have the right bloodline, you have the right equipment, you say the right word. Like, how hard could it be?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like in the Harry Potter case, it's also the magic is much more like in your face.
Yeah.
Like, you're a wizard, Harry. Like, here's a bunch of magic. You say the words and magic happens. But in The Lord of the Rings, it's just like the world is enchanted. So very rarely are they just like, I'm doing some magic now. Like, let me cast a spell, make a staircase, bring in the horses. But all the time, there's just sort of like magic stuff in the air. And as Rebecca said, all the plot things are driven by just like magic, but they're much more like the gravity of the Lord of the Rings. than they
Right.
are
Yeah.
things that you do.
Yeah, it's like diffuse in a way, right? It's sort of it's woven in, and so it's in the background. I think the thing though is that so I was reading about the different ages of Lord of the Rings, and we were thinking about Tolkien's philosophy of history. So he's this like pessimist, historical pessimist, where he thinks like everything's getting worse. It's like cyclical but getting worse. And part of this is reflected, I guess, in the ages of Middle Earth, and part of that is also that basically that the third age in which we find ourselves in Lord of the Rings is one which is actually has like the least amount of magic in it. So it's like it's the one where a lot of the magic has been, either used up or it's fading. Like the whole thing that I guess with the elves that I thought was interesting is that the reason they're so morose is that when the ring is destroyed, then that's going to destroy their rings as well. In which case, but their rings have been the thing that has been sustaining their cities and everything, and so that's why they're always talking about they have to like retreat to the east
west.
or the west. I don't know which way they go, but I guess they have to go west, and which is to go back to Valar or whatever this where they all like came from initially. And that's because like they wouldn't these like verdant like Rivendell and Lothlorien, like that only exists because of the magic of the rings. And once the rings are destroyed, they have to leave. And so they're kind of in this catch-22, I guess, where they're like, well, yeah, we got to kill this ring because it's real bad, because it's like if it gets back to this guy, he's going to kill everyone and enslave everyone. But on the other hand, like that means we can't chill here anymore in our cool palace. And so, but I think that is like, it's part and parcel of, the whole thing where all the magic is sort of receded. And all we're seeing throughout the films are like the vestiges of it, right? Like the huge stone statues that are carved into the rock wall. And that's like, the grandeur and majesty of a past time that's fading. And so, the elves leaving is also the sign of magic leaving, because they're sort of magical beings. Anyway, so I just think it's a little bit like in that regard Game of Thrones, I guess,
Right.
where like the magic has receded from the world, has maybe come back because of these dragons, but it's sort of otherwise largely absent. I guess in its overt form, I'll say.
I think that is consistent with readings of Lord of the Rings as an extended metaphor for the Industrial Revolution, and the environmentalist stuff is especially acute in the movies when you see in the Two Towers, Saruman chopping down forests, and then like the visual difference between the greenness of the Shire and the planting and all the nature, and Isengard, which is all industrial and furnaces and clanging metal. I think there's the idea that the world is getting more advanced, and that makes it worse because all the corners of it that are mysterious and unexplored. I just combined the words unexploited and unexplored to unexplored, but that is in fact what I mean. I think there is this moroseness about where society was headed, and I think we feel that even more acutely now watching Lord of the Rings as the generation that will face apocalyptic climate change than perhaps Tolkien even foresaw when he wrote it.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. I mean, Tolkien was writing the rise of World War II and during the World War II, and so he experienced trench warfare in the First World War, and so for him, technology is basically all bad. It's just ways of killing people more efficiently. He didn't get, unfortunately, to experience the iPhone and Twitter.
And podcasts.
I don't know. Would he have been like, maybe there are pros and cons?
It would have been a different book.
Or 3D printers. I mean, that's cool. 3D printers are cool.
3D printers are
3D
cool.
printing the rings of power.
3D printed rings.
That's right. Yeah, and air conditioning. Did they have air conditioning back then? I don't know. But air conditioning rules.
You wouldn't have made it in the
I would not have made it. We always talk about like how this is the only era I could survive in because I would not have survived.
Because you need to be in like a 3-degree temperature range at all times.
Yeah, I wouldn't survive back in the day. Sorry.
I
It's just
didn't like that.
you're kind of like, you like that too, Rebecca?
She had a blanket on before we started because it was too
chilly,
too cold.
but then put it on the bed because it looked ridiculous.
Oh, you were like a Gandalf? You had your. Oh, I guess he doesn't wear a hood. So you were like Aragorn with the hood on?
Yeah, it was
If
tough
the
to
hood were
watch.
white and fluffy, sure.
It was like a big, comforter.
If
it
you're
was puffy.
cold, you should just put that thing back on because everybody needs to be cozy while they're podcasting.
That's 100% true. Actually, they always say like podcast try to like encompass, like bring it over
like-
the
it's
mic,
like
right?
being
You
in
want to
your
have no
closet.
echo, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we fully support blanket wearing while podcasting.
It's all-
here in
it's
this
up to you.
house.
While you're getting your podcast gear on, Rebecca, we said when we started we were going to start with the intro, and then we just launched into
Then we
discussing
did into it.
whether there's a lot of magic in Lord of the Rings or not. One of the things I think, Bennett, you were interested in was just the first, what is it, like 7 minutes of the film?
It's the first like 12 minutes because Galadriel talks for the first 7 or 8 minutes of the movie. And then it pivots right into Bilbo basically telling us all about the Shire and about the hobbits.
Wait, did you guys see the extended versions or the?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I think there's a difference here because I think actually in the non-extended version there is no Bilbo exposition.
I know,
But
I
this is
was
great.
like,
That's a huge loss.
I've
Fake
seen both
horror.
versions, but yeah, we've only rewatched the normal version.
As we explained, I didn't get through the short version the first time around, so I wasn't going to be able to make it through
Anyway,
extended.
just
Rebecca
Oh,
didn't
no.
make it through extended. so-
well, it's 4. How many? Is it 4.5 hours? 4 hours.
Well, it's like 3.5
Okay.
because it's like 3:55 with 25 minutes of credits.
Whoa. Okay.
Wow. Well, a lot of people worked on it. Okay, so
All right,
tell us
yeah.
what happens. Okay, wait, should we just go through the first 7 minutes and
No,
then
we'll get through all of it because Bennett's going to explain to us what
Bennett's
happens in the
gonna
Shire
explain
that we
everything.
didn't watch.
It began with the forging of the great rings. 3 were given to the elves, immortal, wisest, and fairest of all beings. 7 to the dwarf lords, great miners and craftsmen of the mountain halls. And 9 rings were gifted to the race of men who, above all else, desire power.
Well, so in the first like 7 or 8 minutes, Galadriel just effectively gives you the entire history of Middle-earth that you need to know in order to watch The Lord of the Rings. So she tells us about the forging of the Rings of Power, the first war of like men and elves and dwarves against Sauron, and then how Gollum and Bilbo got the ring. And then once we get, and it's great because it's just like Cate Blanchett telling us what's going on, cut against like the battle scenes and the war against Sauron. We get to see Elrond, so we know he'll come back and whatnot. And then the second it gets to Bilbo in the extended edition, it just like cuts to the Shire and Bilbo starts narrating. And he's like, I'm writing my book. Let me tell you some stuff about hobbits. And it just like plays the Hobbit theme. And Bilbo's like, hobbits are a peaceful people. They like peace and quiet and the brewing of ales and the smoking of pipe weeds. And he, tells us some details about the Shire for like another 3 or 4 minutes, basically until Gandalf rides in on the little cart and Frodo meets with him. But I love everything about this introduction. It's my favorite part of the movie. In part because I think it's just like very smart and economical storytelling. Like it sets up and introduces us to the entire world. We meet a bunch of the main characters. Like we learn who Bilbo is. We see Elrond. We've heard Galadriel's voice, so we know she's like very old and is one of the few people that has all of this knowledge about the ancient world, which is significant because many people think that what happened to the ring is lost, or not everyone knows what happened to the ring. So like we get all of this stuff set up, and it means that we don't have to do all these weird sort of like clunky exposition dump flashback things in the middle of the movie. For example, in the book, a lot of that explanation of what happens to with sort of old Middle Earth is during the Council of Elrond, which just would not work at all because it would be this very jarring, like cutting back and forth between Rivendell and the war against Sauron. So now we just like get it all, and we're just sort of immediately dropped into this enchanted, wonderful little world.
Let me add on that point. Actually, it's also a badass move because Jackson knows that a lot of people coming to this in 2001 have read the book and they're just like sitting down like, okay, here we go, page 1, right? And he doesn't start with page 1. And that's cool, right? That throws you off. Now you're like, oh, wait, okay, how is he gonna structure this differently? Immediately now you're like, okay, I'm in Jackson's world, right? It's his interpretation of these events. And I think that's really cool. And it really, forces the audience to come on his terms. And that's an important thing for filmmakers to do, is to sort of set the tone and the mood, and also to show off, right, the special effects. Because immediately you're like, holy shit, there's like 10 billion people fighting in this massive war. And you're thinking, all right, this is like, he's already like set the bar, right, really high.
And I feel like it's like really showing off in the extended one, because it's like 12 or 13 minutes long. So, and like normally you cannot start a movie with 13 minutes of just like people talking about the world that you're about to enter into.
Yeah.
But I guess when you have a 3.5 hour movie and awesome people narrating it to you, we're just like happy to learn about it.
That does help. Yeah, that does help. I mean, also the visuals are amazing, right? I love the part when Sauron sort of he's walking in and he's like doom doom doom.
He towers above
he's
them.
so tall. He's got this cool like pointy helmet thing, and he's got the cool like ball and chain, and he's just throwing. Every time he hits someone, they go flying. You're just like, yes, this guy's so powerful. I love it.
Oh, it's the best.
Also, the ring shrinks down in size. I love it.
Oh, I love when the ring shrinks. And like we get to see stuff like, the broken blade.
So specific.
Well, it's just showing you how fucking cool it is. Because you're like, this ring was, first of all, it was around this guy's finger that was like the size of your arm, right?
Right.
And then it shrinks down to fit around your finger. And you're like, all right, this is cool. We're sitting in perspective here, right? That's going to be a major part of this movie, force perspective. But then also this ring is super powerful. And you also get to see the sort of the failure of Isildur, right? In a way, this is like the fall of man, right? It is like an original sin thing. And so, but you get to see that moment. And it's so important because that's setting up like later when you meet Aragorn. If you didn't know all this stuff, you're not really realizing that this guy is laboring under inherited guilt of being the guy, the great grandson of the dude who like effed everything up for everyone.
Yeah, so I do think it sets up all the important thematic stuff, or much of the important thematic stuff, with the the ring corrupting you and not wanting to destroy it, which is the end of the entire trilogy. And like the ring shrinking and you being able to see the engraving on the ring and all. There's just so much detail in the beginning that it really feels like you're just entering this world with like thousands of years of history. It feels like it's very lived in. So it like sets the tone. So you're just kind of willing to take what comes for the next few hours when you start to meet Balrogs and orcs and what have you.
Right. So as an adaptation, it's in a way not faithful to the book almost from the beginning because it's just restructuring it. But that I think is to its credit. Now, what do you guys think in general makes for a good literary adaptation? Like, is fidelity to the source material absolutely essential, or is it more like fidelity to the feel or vibe or themes of the source material? Like, what do you think matters to a good adaptation?
Well, the whole time you all were talking about the intro exposition, I was wondering if this was a filmmaking move that only could have been done in 2001 and cannot be commercially replicated now, because it breaks a lot of rules of what counts as like commercial storytelling today, not just the film, but also the book, in that there's a lot of front-loaded exposition. It takes its time. It assumes that the audience is going to have the patience to learn all of this lore and be on board and care about it. And even like the biggest blockbuster adaptation of recent history, which I think is Dune, is more focused in whittling away as much of the book as possible to get a very streamlined, commercially accessible adaptation that I think like works to some extent. But I mean, Peter Jackson, especially in the extended editions, like he really takes his time, and it's a movie made for fans. And for a lot of reasons that I won't get into now, I don't think The Lord of the Rings could be published today if some unknown writer is writing it. Like
It would get hacked
commercial,
away.
there's no effective way to market that in the world of TikTok book marketing. And I also don't know that the films could be made in that way anymore, which is really sad. But I also don't think that the restructuring of the exposition is unfaithful to the books at all. I think it's like the most basic for an adaptation, which is you have less time to tell a story, so you have to put all the important information in one place and get it out as quickly as possible. But I think in terms of mood and tone, in that, it conveys a richness of the world, the ancient history, like all this lore going on that the characters constantly are talking about and thinking about. I think it matches the tone of the book precisely, and that's why fans were so happy with it.
I totally agree. You mentioned Dune, and actually Dune 84 starts with exposition.
I was wondering if I was thinking about Dune the entire time too, when Bennett was talking about the exposition, because it's a combination, right? Because the princess gives a little bit of intro, but then she doesn't cover all of it, because then we still have to do the clunky part where when Paul Atreides is studying up, have to be like, this is the spice
There's a lot of
planet.
exposition.
They're trying to cram so much exposition and piecemeal into that movie, and the 1984 Dune really struggles with exposition. And this one, I think it's actually very smooth. There is a lot in it, but because it's so visually dynamic, you're ready to just sit through 8 minutes of some background. So then you can just get on with the adventure, because once it starts, it's like nonstop.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, Dune kind of is a good comp, because the new Dune does open with a big exposition chunk that's just like, here's what's going on in the world, because Zendaya just narrates to us,
right,
like how the world. She's like, this is what spice is. These people are colonizing our planet, and then she's like, who will be our next oppressor? And then you start following Paul Atreides as the POV character, but it does something kind of similar. But you're definitely right; it couldn't be made.
And it had to be Zendaya.
Well, it had to be Kate Blanchett. But you're right, it couldn't be made today in this, or like they couldn't even make Dune this way, because like they didn't let Villeneuve film both Dunes at once.
Yeah.
No.
Because he wanted to make, both movies at once, and they said, no, you're gonna have to sell Dune 1 before we give you the money to make 2.
I will say this about whether it could be made today. I think you're right, whether it could be made as a film. But as we're seeing, so right now, as we speak, the
$450 million TV
Lord
show.
of the Rings TV show is about to come out. And I think that what I think is kind of sort of interesting about pop culture, broadly speaking, that is different from in today. And I think that was pushed in this direction a lot by things like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter than how pop culture was in the 90s. In the 90s, there was no patience for this kind of stuff on the screen. This sort of stuff like Marvel, like where there's like 1 billion characters and all this backstory and lore that you need to know to understand Endgame. Like there was like nobody was into that kind of stuff. And if you were into Marvel, like, and you read all those comics, I can tell you from firsthand experience, you kept that shit quiet, because it was not cool to be into I read the Infinity War series when I was in the 90s when I was a kid. And I didn't tell my friends, because it was not cool at all. Like, it was cool to be a skateboarder and listen to rap rock. So, and grunge music, yeah. So anyway, but I think there has been a shift in that there's like more of a hunger for this. But at the same time, to your point, Rebecca, I think that it's hard to know whether there's room for like original work in that area, at least in films, and I mean, and maybe in television, I don't know, maybe, but in films, if you're going to have this, it's all going to be adaptations. So it's all going to be based on pre-existing IP that they know they have a built-in audience for.
I saw this tweet the other day that was like, instead of wishing your enemies would go to hell, you should wish that a bad adaptation gets made of their favorite novel, because it's much more likely and it hurts more. And I think upon rewatching the trilogy, I am just really stuck on the question of why good fantasy adaptations are so hard to do, and why we really haven't seen anything on that caliber since the early 2000s. Like, as you said, CGI should have only gotten better. Budgets have gotten larger. Like, filmmaking should have progressed, and instead we have Valerian, and we have the last season of Game of Thrones, and we have like an infinity number of terrible YA fantasy adaptations that are box office bombs, and it seems like a curse that nobody can break.
Lord of the Rings hits that magic sort of middle point in the sense that it has its pre-existing IP, but it also has this crazy amount of lore, so you can get that. but it's broad enough, and it has like a very basic at its core. It's an incredibly basic story, right? The story is get this thing, this MacGuffin over there, and turns out the MacGuffin's like crazy hard to deal with. I think that one of the things that we're seeing now, like, is like a bifurcation. So you see like Marvel stuff, which is like incredibly broad and making very little attempt to engage with anything interesting. And then you see like television, which is like trying to be really specific and lean really hardcore into the lore. Like now we're getting like Game of Thrones prequel, which is gonna build out the series. We're getting these Lord of the Rings prequels. We're also getting these like really heady high sci-fi series. I hear about this secondhand, like Severance and what's the other one? The one about, there are all these ones like personal identity ones, and it gets into really weird shit, which is
adaptation.
Is that an adaptation as well?
I thought there was the
Foundation.
Foundation. Yeah, The Expanse. All these, but these are like weird. I mean, Arrival is also an adaptation that has of like a of a pretty hardcore short story that I think is really great. But I mean, I'm curious, what do you think of sci-fi adaptations?
I think you just convinced me that the sci-fi adaptations are better and are possible.
Well, which names did it for you?
Arrival, which I really liked.
Arrival is pretty good.
Bennett didn't love. But yeah, there are a number of, I think, commercially and critically acclaimed sci-fi shows and films, but just not a lot of fantasy ones. And I think it's in part because so much of fantasy literature follows templates that Tolkien invented. So it's hard to make any of that seem not derivative. And by virtue of that, a lot of sci-fi shows feel derivative of, a lot of fantasy shows feel derivative of Lord of the Rings, including the Rings of Power, which I am full of fear when I think about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's somewhat telling that the big bet they're making for, the Lord of the Rings-esque, but sci-fi adaptation is Dune, which was not a recent book. They're just like, we'll go to the thing that Star Wars is inspired by. Or adapting Asimov, Foundation, because otherwise you're going to end up with a bunch of stuff that looks like it was just inspired by 2001 and Star Wars.
I think this is totally right. And I think that's one of the reasons Game of Thrones was successful, is because it was able to position itself as low fantasy rather than high fantasy, and that there really hadn't been a successful low fantasy show or movie that had really leaned into all the elements of that. And that, and that I remember when that came out and people were like, yeah, this is great. It's like low fantasy. It's what we've all been hankering for. It's the antidote to Lord of the Rings. It's like George R.R. Martin himself, or somebody said like this, the way I think of it is, Game of Thrones is what happens after Return of the King. Like, what's Aragorn's monetary policy going to be? And, those kinds of questions, the nitty gritty stuff that like the Lord of the Rings is, we're in Lord of the Rings, we're too busy trying to save the world. We're not interested in, I don't know, like which system of governance is now going to work.
Rebecca made a face that was just like, how dare you question Aragorn's monetary policy?
It will be the right one. He's the philosopher king.
She was just like, he's a great man.
We were talking about this earlier, but I was trying to articulate why I prefer Lord of the Rings so much to Game of Thrones. And now I don't do philosophy. I just hear a lot about it secondhand. And now I'm taking a class on the mortality of the soul and Aristotle with Martin Hagland next semester because of this guy. So excuse me if I use Plato's ideas in a way that is less than accurate. But I was trying to explain how everything in the Lord of the Rings is a Platonic ideal of that thing. So when they talk about bravery and goodness and valor, the battle scenes are the Platonic ideal of valor and battle. And even evil is like the Platonic ideal of evil. So no one's just like petty or jealous or self-interested. Like they are treacherous, they are deceptive, they are like the worst possible villain. But Lord of the Rings is just full of people like being horny and like
Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
I was like, wait a second, Aragorn's horny?
No. even love and lust in Lord of the Rings is like the Platonic ideal
it's
of
like chaste,
completely monogamous, chaste, romance, and Game of Thrones is the complete opposite of that. And I think realism and fantasy, I mean, some people like it, but fantasy for me is just like a realm of like pure wonder. And if you have that chance to escape and only deal with the platonic ideals of things, like why would you want your fantasy world to move as close to reality as possible?
You're totally right about the characters are really archetypes, right? So there's like good and evil. That I think is a really interesting feature of this both the film and the novels, is that Tolkien seems to he's a moral absolutist. He's like, there's good people and bad people, and there really isn't, what we see in the actual world, which is really a bunch of moral ambiguity and a bunch of people who are mixtures of good and evil and are complex. Sauron is absolute evil, effectively, in this film. I mean, I was reading or learning more about what his motivations are, which are, like, in the film, not made very clear. Maybe they're made clear in the extended editions, but in the theatrical
version,
like,
he's bad. He's really bad.
He's just a bad dude. So there's actually two bad guys. So there's Morgoth, who's like Sauron's boss, and then there's Sauron. And Morgoth is defeated earlier before the Lord of the Rings. And so Morgoth is like the Joker. He's basically the agent of chaos. He's just like, I just want to kill everyone, and I want everything to be destroyed. He even he allies himself with people, and then he kills them. This guy's like a maniac.
Nice.
And then Sauron is his lieutenant, because Morgoth needed someone who had like a more calculating mind. And Sauron apparently, so his whole thing is actually order. So he's basically like, he fancies himself basically better than everyone. He's like, I'm smarter than you. If you just allow me to rule you, I'll make everything better for everyone. So you could think of him kind of as like a lunatic utilitarian, where he's basically just like, look, give me the power. Some people are going to suffer. Great. But it's going to be better overall because I've got the like full, picture in mind. And so that's actually apparently Sauron's like really, that's like his whole vibe. Doesn't come out in the movies at all. Yeah, so that actually is slightly grayer. It's like we can't understand him, right? We're like, I get that, I guess. You're also wrong, but I can make sense of you. Whereas like somebody who's just acting randomly, that we can't make sense of that kind of character. Or someone who's just pure evil, like where you're just like, what I do is I just look at the list of things, and if it says evil, I do that. That kind of character, you're like, I don't understand that. I'm like, why do you care about this list of things rather than that? No, it's just that says it's bad, so I'm going for it. And that's kind of how Sauron plays in the movies. But I actually think it's kind of interesting to me that he fancies himself a benevolent dictator.
Yeah, I mean, I guess as far as I ever inferred any motivation for Sauron from the films, which they are really just like, he's really bad and he wants to take over Middle Earth. It was that he's, there's something in his backstory so that he's kind of like drunk on power.
Yeah.
And then it would just kind of fit in with this theme about power corrupting you, and that, once you want it, you want all of it. And that he was just supposed to be like the purest distillation of, corrupted by power. So he wants to have power over everything, which fits with the, he needs to dominate the earth, that, Saruman ends up doing for him. And he just wants invade and take over all of the lands.
And that is why Tom Bombadil is such a good character.
Wait, so let's get into Tom Bombadil. So Bennett, having just recently, pored over the tome that is the Fellowship of the Ring, and come across this character Tom Bombadil, where you're like, wait, that guy's not in the movies. Tell us a bit about Tom Bombadil.
Yeah, who is Tom Bombadil?
Tom Bombadil is the man. The hobbits meet him before they get to the prancing pony, and he's like out of the book before they get to the prancing pony. But effectively, the way he's introduced is Merry and Pippin like get sucked into a tree, like they're in the Shire out in the woods, and some tree kind of eats them up like it does in one of the extended scenes in The Two Towers. And they're like, what are we going to do? They're going to get eaten by this tree. And then Tom Bombadil comes along, just like strolls out of the forest and is like, hey, tree, let them go. And he invites them over to his house. And he's like, hi, I'm Tom Bombadil. I'm just this guy. I live in the woods. Yeah, I just kind of like hang out here. The trees listen to me. I do what I want. No one messes with me. They get caught in some, sort of trouble again on their way to the prancing pony. And he just like shows up and lets them out of it and disappears. But the like significant, interesting things are, one, that Frodo gives him the ring and he's just like unfazed by it. just kind of, he holds it up to his eye, looks through it, is like, oh, this is kind of fun, and gives it back, but seems like he just doesn't care at all about the ring. And he shows no meaningful interest in getting involved in any of the like politics stuff with Sauron. And in the book, they even discuss at the Council of Elrond just like giving the ring to Tom Bombadil and letting him hold on to it because he's unfazed by it. And Elrond is like, you could, but he'd probably forget about it and just like lose it because he doesn't care about it at all. So he's this like complete enigma in the whole, Middle Earth verse, because he seems like he's the one character that just like has all the power in the world effectively when he's holding the ring, and just couldn't care less. All he wants to do is hang out on his little slice of forest and like smoke his pipe weed.
So the wizards, I should mention the wizards here. So Gandalf is part of the clan of wizards called the Astari, and there are 5 of them, but we only meet 2 of them. But one of them reminded me a little bit of Tom Bombadil, Radagast. So Radagast is this dude who, the brown. He's like into like nature, but like he's sent there to the 5 wizards are sent there to basically like shepherd the creation and make sure like people like Sauron, don't mess up things up too bad. But Radagast doesn't end up getting involved in any of this because he's just hanging out with his birds.
Mm-hmm.
So the eagle that Gandalf flies on is Radagast's.
Oh, that's Radagast's eagle. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, which is made clear in the book, but is not, in the movie, just like a bird shows up and takes it. So he's a little involved, but it does seem like, at least several of the wizards are just kind of hanging out, or at least we're not told what's up with them.
Yeah, it's like,
and Tom Bombadil is like of a similar class. Like at some point, he's like, "Oh, I've been around as long as time. I was around before the elves. I was there for the first war with Sauron. Didn't care about that either." He's like, "I just kind of hang out and watch stuff."
It's great. Yeah, it's good times, man. If you're immortal, I mean, I get that vibe. If you're immortal, you're just sort of like, I'll just chill, just sit back and chill.
I mean, nature is really cool. I just like imagine if our kid is 3 and really
he's
into nature.
He's a Radagast type of guy.
He is a bit of a Radagast. Like I feel like he'll just stop Dad on a walk and to be like, "This moss is so soft on my hands."
We were down in the Seaport district of Boston yesterday, and there's a lot going on. Right, there's all these people. There's all these events happening. There's boats. I look over, and our son has found this tree that's just planted in the middle of the ground somewhere, and he's just putting dirt on his head. He's just pulling dirt up and just sprinkling it on his head, and then like being like, "I got dirt," and I'm like, "What are you talking? There's a boat here. You've never seen a boat in your life." Like, he's like, "Nah, I gotta just hang out with the dirt." So he's a bit of a Radagast.
Tom Bombadil, yeah.
Or a Bombadil. That's one of the cool things about Lord of the Rings is that there's so much there. And it feels like he's got everything covered, right? He's like, you want a dude who's basically a god but doesn't care about anything? Bombadil, I got you covered. Like, you want a dude who's super powerful and is really good? Gandalf, I've got you covered. You want a dude who's super powerful and really bad? Sauron. So it turns out, I was trying to figure out the structure of these things. I'm just going to break this down briefly because I thought it was interesting when I was learning about this, because I was thinking like, this is unlike any of the fantasy that I've engaged with. I actually did not know any of this when I read Lord of the Rings, because I just assumed Gandalf's like a wizard, like in Dungeons & Dragons, where you can learn magic. No. So Gandalf is a god. But he's like a lesser god. So there's the head god, then there's the Valar and the Maiar. And the Valar are like the supreme beings that follow right under the main god. And then the Maiar are like their like underlings. They just they like assist the Valar. And we don't meet any Valar in Lord of the Rings. But we do meet some Maiar. Gandalf is a Maiar. The Balrog is a Maiar. And Sauron is a Maiar. So, and these guys are basically gods. And basically, they are immortal. In a way that the elves, like more powerful than the elvish immortality. So elves live forever, but they can be killed. The Maiar, like Gandalf, as we learn in the second book, he can be killed, but he'll just be resurrected. So he sort of has, he will just keep coming back until his mission is fulfilled. And in a way, Sauron he's of that same power. But what the immediate question I had when I was thinking about this is like, all right, so Gandalf, Sauron are sort of on the same level. Maybe Sauron's a little bit more powerful, but they're kind of like both like superheroes effectively in this world. Why doesn't Gandalf just fight Sauron? But apparently his mission priority, like he's like a Terminator whose mission priority prevents him from engaging Sauron directly. He can help everyone else, but he actually can't fight Sauron.
I'm thinking about how fantasy writers are trained today. And this is related to your thought on, the internal world building. And the common wisdom now is you have to think hardly enough about your world so that the reader trusts you to believe in it. And so the world seems real. And this is where a lot of contemporary fantasy novels fail. The world building seems incoherent. The magical rules don't make sense. The plot seems contrived to move the plot forward, but there are very obvious world building reasons why things don't have to happen the way they should. And people get very nitpicky, and it throws the reader out of the story. But Tolkien has spent so long thinking about this world and planned it out so meticulously that the story is equally exciting and engaging if you know absolutely nothing about the classes of beings and what Gandalf is and his power level relative to Sauron's. You trust the creator of the fantasy world so much that you're happy to play around chaotically in it. So when you're watching The Fellowship of the Rings and when you're reading the book, at least for me, it never crosses my mind like, oh, why isn't Gandalf just doing this instead? I'm happy to just go with the flow because I trust that there's all this lore and rules and unwritten codes that are there and that are coherent and that make sense because the history of the world feels real. And I trust that Tolkien has thought of it already. And that kind of trust is very, very difficult to earn. And the vast majority of fantasy films and novels don't earn that. Like even most Marvel films don't earn that level of trust from reader one.
I totally agree. And what I think is so cool about Lord of the Rings is he does that not by giving you lots of information, but actually withholding it. So the exact opposite of this is Harry Potter, but Harry Potter just gives you all this information, but then you immediately have questions, like the one I had about the app rating thing. But it raises those questions because it is explicit about the rules, so explicit about its rules that now you're just like, all right, immediately that's the question I have. But by not being explicit in Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, in a way, just sort of sets those questions aside. He says, like, these are really not the questions you should be focused on. And I was focused on them when I first read it because I'd come to it from Dungeons and Dragons, which is like obviously a rule-based game system. And so I was like thinking in that way. But I think the reader of Lord of the Rings in 1945 or whenever it was first published, presumably they're not thinking like that. And they're not being encouraged to think that way. And I think that might be part of how he's able to gain the reader's trust.
I think the craft trick here is not being explicit about the rules. I think it is evoking a sense of deep history and lore so that you trust that even when there are contradictions, there are reasons for those contradictions. Middle Earth feels so real and its history feels so real in a way that most fantasy novels don't, because you have to construct those from scratch. And when you're reading Lord of the Rings, you think, oh, like somebody is really telling me about things that happened in some distant era in some distant parallel universe. It's hard to evoke.
It is true. Apparently, Tolkien envisioned this as a prehistory of the actual world.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't quite know exactly what we're supposed to make of that, but it is supposed to be. So Middle Earth, apparently, I don't know quite how this works. It's supposed to be Earth, but at a time before history. So it's like it's like an actual world fantasy, I suppose. It's a historical fantasy.
Historical. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that stuck out to me in the Gandalf power in particular that is perhaps related to being of this world is, like Tolkien was a pretty serious Christian, and I'm told was kind of like trying to square sneaking some Christianity into the Lord of the Rings with, there being a ton of gods and whatnot.
I don't think Christianity snuck into.
Okay, well, it's in there, but one of the cases where you might think it's in there is just like Gandalf isn't allowed to go just beat the bad guy for you. In the same way that in problem of evil type cases, God's supposed to kind of let humans do their own thing. So Gandalf he can help us, he can help the fellowship along, but he can't just like go do it for them. He's got to let the mortals or, the non-God assistants settle things for themselves.
Mm-hmm. It's an amazing movie, but it's also a miracle, as we've been talking about, it's a miracle this movie got made. So one of the things that I was curious about is, how did this movie get made? I mean, here's the first question. When Laura was like, I'm going to read about how this movie got made. I was like, first question, how did Peter Jackson, a dude who had made a couple small movies before this, get the rights to Lord of the Rings?
I mean, so I didn't get a very good answer to that. The rights were bought by one producer Paul Zantz, who had produced One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, among other films, and he
also an adaptation.
Also an adaptation, and I guess like various directors had played with the idea of doing this. George Lucas, Spielberg, John Borman.
Oh my God, Borman. Yeah, that's right. Borman. That's why he did Excalibur.
Right. Yeah. So I think maybe they all kind of got distracted with other stuff in some ways, right? Like George Lucas right now is doing his prequels.
I'm going to do Zardoz.
Yeah, Borman's like God Zardoz. George Lucas around this time is doing the prequels, right? Yeah. So he's got he's off to the races on his own thing. And I think like for a while too, like everybody had picked it up and then just be like, the technology, like the CGI is just not quite there. Like we need so much magic. It's not going to look good on screen. I mean, Spielberg is very thoughtful about this, right? Like he was on the forefront of it with Jurassic Park, but I think he just got distracted by other projects. So nobody really totally wanted to pick up the ball and run with it. And Jackson did. And at this point he had a first look relationship with Weinstein, and Weinstein wasn't interested. Miramax was interested enough to work with Jackson and to talk about buying the rights.
I see.
But very quickly, like they ran up to the fact that that Miramax was owned by Disney. So Weinstein's interested, but he knows it's going to be expensive, and Miramax has a budget cap from Disney. Mm-hmm. They don't usually spend this much money on it. So Weinstein wants to make it one movie. He's like, can you just do Lord of the Rings one movie? And, and so and I think Jackson, because he's contractually obligated to bring every project he has to the Weinsteins first at this point, like kind of has to play ball with Weinstein on this, but obviously does not want to make it one movie. He wants to make it two. He doesn't even want to I think he can't even
wait, I'd heard he wanted to do Hobbit
first.
Lord of the Rings first. 1, Lord of the Rings 2, somehow doing the 3 books in 2 movies.
Yes. But he couldn't get the rights to Hobbit. Saul this rights are split up between Hobbit and Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
So they can run with Lord of the Rings, they can't run with Hobbit at that point. And so he's like, okay, I want to make 2 movies. Weinstein says, can you make it 1? And meanwhile, Disney's like, can you just not? Like Disney's not into it at all. So Weinstein basically says, all right, fine. Peter Jackson, I give you 1 week. You have to shop it around to all the studios. If somebody will buy it, I get 5% of the gross. And I'll help produce it. And because I've got the rights now. And that's his deal. And he says, if you can't find somebody to make it, now I have the rights. So I'll just find another director to do it in one movie the way I want to do it.
I'll get John Borman in here.
So Jackson goes around and shops it to everybody, and nobody wants it. So his last day in LA, he's gonna get on a flight to New Zealand later that day. He meets with New Line, and they almost don't take the meeting because everybody in town has heard about this 5% Weinstein thing, and they're just like, no way in hell are we giving 5% of our gross to Weinstein. That's a terrible deal. But a couple of the execs at New Line knew Peter Jackson. I think he had helped with something on Nightmare on Elm Street, and so they were like, we're gonna take this meeting as a courtesy. And Peter Jackson managed his pitch worked for New Line. So New Line was founded in 1967.
Are we going all the way back?
I'm going to do New Line real quick because I think New Line is cool. I really think there was the only way this got made is because New Line was in a very specific position at this point.
That's the other thing about just to back up really quickly. Yeah. I mean, I think the interesting thing about when we ask these questions, could this ever get made? How did this get made? And it's often just a bunch of random shit.
Yeah.
Right. And that's always how these things, movies are every movie's a miracle in a way. And it's because a bunch of random things are happening where this guy was backed into a corner. So he gave up the rights to this thing. And so anyway, a New Line ends up, cornered effectively.
Yeah. So they were originally founded in 1967. And they their thing was bringing art house and forum and cult films to college campuses. They first made their bread distributing Reefer Madness to college campuses.
Yeah, art house stuff. I
said cult classics. But very quickly they became the studio that would take a chance on an arty project that then directors went on to work with bigger studios once they got really big. So they made Pink Flamingos, Nightmare on Elm Street.
Okay,
They made The Mask. They made Austin Powers, Boogie Nights. So and Paul Thomas Anderson worked with them before he went on to bigger things, and Fincher with Seven. So they had like a really great track record. And at that point, Ted Turner had bought them and basically didn't ask about their budget because they didn't tend to spend a lot, and he never was in the weeds with them. They just kind of did their thing because they've like had only had one flop, I think, ever.
Wow.
Or something. Little Nicky was their flop.
I believe that they also did Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
They did.
Was a favorite of mine growing up.
Correct.
So, yeah.
They did. But Time Warner then buys Ted Turner's company. So now they've got New Line as like this weird orphan child, and they just like don't understand it at all, what its brand is, and they're trying to get rid of it. It's
a good spot to be in. Honestly.
Yeah. So now Bob Shaye, who's the founder and executive at New Line Cinema, is sort of like, we were in the spot where we weren't wanted. We found ourselves without a slate of movies, and we were trying to prove ourselves, and we had space. And all of a sudden, this opportunity comes up to make not one, but 3 movies, because that's what happens. Jackson walks in and says, I want to make 2 movies, 2 Lord of the Rings movies. And they love his pitch. And they're like, why don't you just do 3? It's 3 books. Why don't you just do 3? Bada boom, like 3 Christmases. We got it all lined up. But it's like, it's crazy because it very quickly became something that almost killed them, because Jackson thought it was going to cost $60 million to make each movie. And it actually cost like over $100 million to make each movie. And they had never spent that much money on anything. And if they didn't get the success for the first movie, it was going to bankrupt them.
Shout out to Peter Jackson.
Yeah, that's the
Isn't
other
that
thing
insane?
that's wild about this is as you know, but just to mention this to the audience. I mean, the films were made concurrently, that's the thing, which is like completely mind-boggling.
Yeah,
and released 1 year after another.
Yeah. So Bob Shaye, the director of New Line, was like, okay, so we'll do this 3 movies, like totally, we're on board, but also like we'll make 1 and see what happens. And Jackson was like, oh, sorry, no, we have to make them all at once. Like, sorry.
But what was the reasoning? Because
2
I thought
reasons.
this was kind of interesting.
One was that he wanted the characters to all be the same age. I mean, this takes place only over a period of like a month, I think, the 3 movies. So they're going to hire a teenage Elijah Wood. He wants them to look like a teenage Elijah Wood the whole time. And then the other thing is that he had such a strong vision for building real sets and taking, bulldozers and cutting into the New Zealand landscape. He's like, New Zealand's not going to put up with us being on and off just, here for 4, 5, 6 years as we make these movies. We got to just get in there, build the sets, make it all at once. Because, the government's not going to allow us to basically like block their roads on and off for years. Mm-hmm. But yeah, nobody had really made anything on this scale before. But it's crazy that like a small studio that was like, yeah, we can pay for 60 million, quickly found out that it had to be more like 120 million per movie, and they had to do it all at once.
Yeah, more like 360 million.
Yeah.
But so what's wild about this is like there is a lot of green screen in this movie, but because he's doing practical effects, that's a big thing that's boxing them in, is all the practical stuff. Without that demand for doing things practically, like building sets, like they build large parts of Minas Tirith and all that for Return of the King, like you just do, and nowadays you just do it on a green screen. And then that issue doesn't arise at all about we need to mess up the New Zealand countryside.
Right. Now they make movies where like people can just come on their own schedule to Atlanta, and like people in the movie don't even meet. Right. I think though, we were talking about movies, why some of them there haven't been successful fantasy adaptations, and then one of the reasons is that they all feel derivative.
Yeah.
And there's nothing really as fully fleshed out as Tolkien's world, because nobody usually writes an encyclopedia to go with their
and creates their own
books.
languages.
Right, exactly. But Jackson like brings the same sort of level of like mad detail and commitment to fully forming the world in a way that is very difficult to do, to make a movie or a TV show now, for lots of practical reasons. It's just that like New Line like lost their mind, and I'm so glad they did.
Yeah. It's a towering achievement. I mean, one of the things about the films I think that are great, and we talked briefly about this, and I'm just going to mention it again, it's just the broad thematic depth to the film. So there's this hero's journey that we're really seeing just the beginning of. And we know where this is headed. We all know where the story is going. And what I think is so cool watching these films in close succession is you watch Frodo, it's like what happens to presidents, right? They always show like the portrait of the president before they take the oath, and then after they've left office 8 years later, and like they look like a shell of themselves. And Frodo by the end is a broken person. The journey has destroyed him. And I think that, he is ultimately the hero of the film, right? Aragorn is Aragorn is tested and he rises to the occasion. But like, he's going to be fine at the end. He's going to be king and everything. Frodo has to leave. He has to basically go to whatever this mystical elf palace is. He's borne the burden of the entire world in a way for however long, a month or whatever, but it's been like this torturous journey. And I think that aspect of heroism is something that often isn't explored in, for example, Marvel movies today. Not to knock Marvel movies, but it often isn't the case that the heroes are really shown as having to bear a significant burden. Of course, Spider-Man, that's a huge part of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, but less so, I think, today. And I think The Lord of the Rings really gets this really, really well.
I mean, not to armchair psychologize, and I could be better read on like the Tolkien biographies, but you have to think that a lot of this is coming from his experience fighting in World War I, watching a lot of his friends die, probably dealing with PTSD. I mean, Tolkien really knows what it is like to look at the gates of Mordor and have to come back to it and go back to everyday life in Oxford or the Shire and pretend everything is okay when it's not.
I think that's right. I think it's also right that that's partly why the hobbits take center stage is who are fighting these wars? Just ordinary people. And the hobbits are in a way a distillation of that. They're not superhuman. They're not elves. They don't
ordinary
have super
people
strength.
/ children.
Yeah, they're children. Yeah, they're innocents.
I mean, we're sending like 18-year-olds to war.
Right.
They're kids.
Right. And their innocence is ultimately going to be corrupted by it, ultimately. I mean, and they have to do that in order to save the innocence of the rest of the Shire, the hobbits, and so on. So it is a sacrifice, right? Ultimately, they have to be the sacrificial lambs. And what I think is kind of cool is later on this comes up, but Sam and Frodo, they're trying to muster the courage to continue and so on. And Sam sort of brings up, he's like, people are going to talk about us, right? Like they're going to tell our story. Isn't that going to be cool? And in a way, like that's the kind of plight of the hero, is to just exist as a myth. The life of a war vet is pretty horrible, but hopefully you can like live on in the tales of the people who appreciated your sacrifice, and that's ultimately what you're fighting for. So I think that it's this kind of reminder. It's like when you're running and you don't want to stop, right? You part of you wants to stop, and part of you doesn't want to stop running because you're super tired, but you got to push through somehow, and they have to push through various points by reminding themselves what they're actually fighting for, the innocence of the remaining hobbits.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's like what happens in the best line of this movie when, Frodo says, I wish the ring had never come to me. And then Gandalf gets to give his speech that's like, so do all who live to see such times, but all we have to choose is what to do with the time given us. Like there's this theme running through that's like, Frodo's not particularly interested in confronting this evil. Like he'd much rather not have to do it. He recognizes that he has to, which I think is also related to this like power corrupting effect of the ring. Mm-hmm. Like it seems like as far as the ring goes, or like the temptation of evil goes, the way the ring works is that it can most easily corrupt the people that are sort of already powerful, and thereby therefore sort of like automatically, it seems like Tolkien thinks, want more power. So like Gandalf obviously is like, don't give me the ring. Galadriel like sees it as this great temptation, and for her, like the great thing is that she didn't take it. But Frodo does take it and is still doing okay. So it seems like part of the reason that he's able to come out on the other side at all is that he starts on this like very pure front where he's just like, he's a hobbit. He just wants to live in peace and quiet. He wishes this would never come to him. Whereas a lot of the other players involved, are fighting for good, but there's at least some part of them that's like, it would be cool if I could get this ring and like take over the world.
I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. There are other forces at work in this world, Frodo, besides the will of evil. Bilbo was meant to find the ring, in which case you also were meant to have it. And that is an encouraging thought.
The archetype of the great hero is the one who assumes the mantle almost unwillingly. They're not looking to gain anything by this. I mean, that's the kind of model of the public servant, right? That's why we even call politicians public servants, is that you're not supposed to be doing this to further your own ends. You're supposed to be doing this as a sacrifice. And that was what this was thought of in democracies and throughout American history, was like, if you were rich, the thought was like, now I'm going to become a politician, not because that's the next evolution of getting power. It's rather, now it's time to give back. Now it's time to give of myself to the country that have helped me gain all these riches. And, it was like a duty. Yeah. Anyway, I think that is something Tolkien is definitely tapping into here, and that Frodo assumes the mantle, not just sort of unwillingly, but in a way unknowingly, because of his innocence.
Well, I mean, he sort of just gets dragged along at different points, right? Because he doesn't even he wants to give it to Gandalf immediately when he knows once he picks it out of the fire, right? And he's just like, oh, no, thanks. And then he thinks he's just going to go to the pony. Right. And then he thinks, okay, now we just got to get to the
Rivendell. Once we're at Rivendell, I'm good.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, Sam's like packing up, right? Like he really has no idea what he's in for, but he didn't even want any amount of adventure to begin with. He's not Bilbo.
But in Rivendell, that's where he becomes the hero, right? And it's in his initial heroic step, because he then assumes the mantle.
Right.
Yeah, speaking of Rivendell, I want to shout out one of the most poignant scenes in the entire film that I only noticed on this watch. It's when, during the Council of Elrond, everyone's screaming at each other, and Frodo gets up and he says, I'll do it, I'll take it. And he has to repeat himself several times. And then we just get Ian McKellen's face, and he closes his eyes, and because he knew what was coming, and he's been expecting this, and he knows what it means for Frodo. And it's just like him silently blinking and sighing, and he's just completely deflated. And I never lingered on that scene until now, but it almost made me cry.
Yeah.
I will take it. Lord, give us I will take it. I will take the ring to Mordor. Though I do not know the way.
I will help you bear this burden, Frodo Baggins, as long as it is yours to bear.
Because he's the only one, I think, who really knows what's going to happen. I think everyone else thinks, including Frodo, even in that moment, we will all march as this united fellowship to Mordor, and they'll fight off all bad guys, and I will drop the ring in the pit, and yay! But I think Gandalf sort of knows that he already foresees that the fellowship will fracture and break, and that this is ultimately going to be Frodo's burden. Almost entirely, except for the Sam part. I mean, Sam is there as his as his support, but really, I think Gandalf is just thinking, this is just on you, man. And that sucks, but also we have no other choice. And so I totally agree with you, Rebecca. That part is, I think, one of the, in a movie with a lot of powerful scenes, that's an incredibly powerful one. And of course, Jackson plays it really well, because I think the music cuts in, and it's just a shot on Gandalf, and it maybe even goes into slightly slow motion. He's really wanting you to linger on this moment.
Yeah, and it's just a second. It lingers a little too long, and it tells us everything we need to know.
Yeah, the other thing is just, as we were talking about with absolute evil and the relationship between evil and corruption, and I liked what you were saying, Bennett, earlier about the gaining of power creates this vacuum of power, which then you're like, I need more power. And then you keep going. And one of the things I was interested in asking you guys about is this a structural feature of human psychology? Of course, many of these creatures in this world are not human, but is it something about just human psychology in general that we are drawn to something, a certain degree of power for normal reasons because we want to control our environment. But then once we have it, it becomes this like temptation where we like need more of it. And it's this insatiable drive to get more of this thing. Like we've now tasted the fruit and we can't get enough of it. Like, is that just like some basic feature of our psychology that Tolkien is tapping into?
It seems to me like he's tapping into this like slightly caricatured, but not in a bad way, feature of our psychology. So it does seem like he thinks everyone that, gets some power is going to recognize that there's like something attractive in it. Like they're going to be like, oh, I kind of like this. And then, his caricature of it is that once you get it, you just like sort of have this increasingly insatiable drive for it, corresponding to how much power you have. And the more powerful beings just like have a much harder time resisting the ring because they have this stronger temptation for power.
Yeah.
But I take it that the kernel of truth he's tapping into is that there's something sort of like tempting about power or tempting about evil. That's just sort of like you get a little taste of it and you're like, oh, I see why you would want that. So I think you're supposed to take it that it's just kind of commenting on our corruptibility and like playing it up by way of the MacGuffin.
The flip side too of it is that Saruman represents someone who who has the power, right? He's like a wizard, he's in a good spot, but like he'll do whatever it takes not to lose that power, right? So he sees the threat. He's like, look, we can't beat Sauron, so let's join him, right? And that is the other side of it, is like what you'll do to retain that power.
Bennett and I were chatting earlier today about what to do with the case of Gollum in the scheme of what the ring says about the acquisition of power. And our initial theory was what the ring says is people with power want more power, and that's why the ring is attractive. And even creatures of little power seek the ring for more power. But Gollum's relationship with the ring is completely different in that his life is terrible with the ring. He uses it to be invisible sometimes, but he lives in squalor. He eats raw fish. He's naked all the time. Like Gollum cannot be happy. He lives entirely in servitude of the ring. And at first I was just very confused about this. And I thought, well, we can't square this with the power corrupts thesis. But the more I thought about it, the more I think it's actually making the argument that Gollum is the only creature who is under no illusions of what the ring has done to him, and it's the creatures of higher power who, like Gandalf and Galadriel and Boromir, who are delusional enough to think that they could control the ring, while in fact the ring could control him. So I think that gets to something deeper, not just that power corrupts, but power is addictive, and power, in fact, causes you to do things that are self-destructive in pursuit of more power.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that Gollum is he's basically an addict, and yeah, he should just get rid of this thing, right? Although he would die if he did. So there is like a component there, but yeah, the life that he's living is quite terrible.
Yeah, I mean, the Gollum living this bad life is, I think in some sense, Rebecca, you've convinced me, the like first version we see in the movies of this theme that Tolkien has, that's kind of like evil destroys itself or undermines itself or like brings destruction upon itself, that shows up at various points, with the orcs and the goblins and whatnot, and the Two Towers in Return of the King. But it starts to show us there's something tempting about it. But you just end up in this terrible spot. You end up accidentally letting your hobbits escape many times because you're arguing with each other, or you end up addicted to the ring or whatever it might be. Or even Gollum's fate at the end of the Return of the King sort of spells this out. But yeah, he's got this theme that's just like, you want evil, you feel the temptation of power, whatever it might be, and then once you have it, you're like, that's not what I wanted. Things aren't going well.
But you're sort of stuck. And now it's like too late. Yeah. And you're you've been corrupted now. And so you can't get back that innocence. It is interesting that the most heroic moments in this movie, in this installment, are refusals to accept the ring. Those are all the most heroic moments, like Aragorn's refusal. In a way, Boromir's sort of, his battle is, I think his conflict is one of the more tragic aspects of it, because you see, I mean, I think he's supposed to be a stand-in for us as like the reader. Like we are the corruptible Boromirs who would be kidding ourselves if we would think we're not actually, we would just refuse the ring like Aragorn. I think we would all be in that situation where we would be tempted to take the ring and to use it. And then also Galadriel's refusal, right? I think like those refusals are of broader importance because they are the moments of uncorruptibility of these characters, but also they are showing, I think, what Tolkien saying like, this is how you should be. Like, this is how a hero is. The hero is some person who like refuses the temptation that they know would lead them to darkness.
I pass the test. I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel.
I cannot do this alone.
You are a ring bearer, Frodo. To bear a ring of power is to be alone. This task was appointed to you. And if you do not find a way, no one will.
Galadriel's refusal is the one that got me, and the way that the Gandalf moment got you. I mean, because he just when she after she turns into a crazy monster or whatever, and she's like, "Whew, I did it." Frodo was just like, "Is there nobody who can help me out here?" Like he's like, "I can't do this by myself." I really like he's just looking for somebody to trust, somebody who seems more capable than him. He's just like, "Really, it's me?" And like I think she says she's just basically like, "No, that's all you, bro. Sorry." And also, if you fail, we're all doomed.
Yeah.
Like it was some real tough love. I really felt so sad for him in that moment. He's so tired already, and there's so much more to go.
Yeah, and Frodo goes on this whole transition with his relationship to the ring, because at first he is just like, I'll give it to anybody I can. Like this is, I do not want this. He's just like, you want it? They're like, don't offer it to me. And then, at some point he starts to realize like, I have to be the one to bear it, and he won't give it to anyone else because he recognizes it needs to be him. And then by the end, he won't give it to anyone else
because it's his.
So, yeah,
yeah.
That's right. Just thinking about the addict dimension, a solution for addicts is to basically be like, I can't be near the thing that I'm addicted to, right? So like if for people who are sober, they're just like, it's not that I have one drink. It's like, no, I cannot have alcohol or like around me. And that is what all the other characters do, right? Gandalf he can't even touch the ring. And Aragorn comes very close, right? When he closes Frodo's hand. But that is, I think that's Aragorn, in a way, his most heroic moment.
I would have gone with you to the end. Into the very fires of Mordor.
I know. Look after the others. Especially Sam. He will not understand.
I think Viggo does a really good job in that moment where he just, you realize like he is a pure soul. But the other thing I think is cool about Aragorn is that he's the one everyone expects to fail because he's the descendant of the Adam, the guy who the initial fall. And so he's the one laboring under the most pressure to uphold this. And I think everyone's like, yeah, that guy's going to get corrupted because whatever his great granddaddy did. So in a way, the stakes are really high for him. And so when he refuses it, and it's a quiet moment, right? It's just the two of them. When he refuses it, it's like he's overcoming all this generational trauma that's been sort of built up in his history, in his bloodline. And that's why I think it's actually these tiny little moments, right? The other movies are going to have these massive moments of battles and killing and things. But I love this movie for just the little moments of I think, what are really dramatic heroism. I'm curious, just for one thing to end on for you guys, I just kind of gave away my answer to this question, but do you have a favorite of the three movies?
Well, your answer is moving. What you've just said is moving me a little. But I love The Two Towers.
The Two Towers slaps.
Yeah, I think. The Two Towers is unreal.
It is so good.
But I do think the first time I watched them, I was just like, The Return of the King is the best one, sort of for sure. And Fellowship was like by far my least favorite. I was just like, I don't think Fellowship is all that good. And then this year when I rewatched them all again, I was like, oh, The Return of the King is pretty good. Like it ties up everything nicely. It's got 40 minutes of stuff at the end. And then when I rewatched Fellowship, I was like, this is amazing. Like Return of the King can only work if you nail this movie and do all of this setup. So, I still love, I love the ends. So that's my Two Towers thing. But now I do think Fellowship is like right up there with the Two Towers, if it's not better. Because just like the level of world building in the first half of this movie and then the nice little character moments in the end they're amazing.
Well, we'll have to see as we go forward where Laura stands on these, because I think I'll be interested to know what you think, Laura. But we'll wait till you've seen them all recently.
Okay. Did Rebecca have anything to add besides the
you
Two
were
Towers
just Two Towers all the way?
I will just say this about the Two Towers, Laura, if you were apprehensive about whether you might enjoy it. A few days ago, we had two friends over at night to watch it, and we didn't start until like 8:30.
And one of them had just flown in.
And one of them had just flown in from England and hadn't slept in like 30 hours. And she was like, no, let's do this. I love the Two Towers. And then she was like, oh, but I might fall asleep for some of it. And it was like, it's fine. Like, we've all seen it before. And like sleeping during The Lord of the Rings, you're still a part of the process. You wake up for the good parts. And she did, in fact, wake up for all of the good parts, during which we were just like shaking in our seats, convulsing with excitement. I declared at one point, I'm frothing at the mouth. This is during the March of the Ents, when Treebeard's like,
I do like the trees.
Go. And then like the music's like, oh, 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 oh. And
can you make it play that?
Yeah, totally.
We'll drop in the music there.
It's very satisfying too. Because they're taking out Saruman. He's been such a dick to the trees.
Saruman has been a bit of a dick to the trees. That was my that was my other stupid comment from this first movie. Is like, how we not know Saruman bad? Like, that, have you seen that tower? Like, there was no way the Gandalf's like, hey, my boss Saruman's like, he'll definitely know what to do. I'm like, have you seen his tower? He's so evil. Like, who has like a giant pointy black tower and they're not evil? Come on.
But like they do this nice setting up. They don't show you the tower right away, I don't think. They show you Gandalf and Saruman like walking through Saruman's little garden.
Yeah, okay. That's true.
Which also sets up the nice contrast with, when he starts digging holes and all. So another case for the Fellowship is just like setting up all the good stuff that happens in the next two movies. So
I love it.
Look,
it gets a lot of credit.
I sleep through most of the movies we see together. I go to bed at 11. I stayed up until 1:30 for the Two Towers. The Two Towers is like caffeine injected straight into my veins. It's incredible.
We'll see. Because the weird thing about me is that like action scenes are a bit of a narcotic for me. Like I fall asleep during the most boomy, loudy fights. I don't know why. Like there's no dialogue, I'm out. So, but we'll see. Maybe I won't fall asleep this time, Justin.
All right, we'll see.
I'm excited. They've gotten me amped up. Or I'll drink coffee ahead of it.
You do have to go extended for the Two Towers because there's a scene, or at least you have to watch one scene from the extended edition. There's a scene that is a flashback between Boromir and Denethor. Is that his dad's name? Denethor? That like I think makes the Boromir arc in this movie significantly better. Like it just does a lot of the character motivation work for why Boromir is like going after the ring right when they get to Rivendell. And I was like, I feel much worse for Boromir after watching this scene. It should have been in Fellowship.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think part of the reason the Boromir stuff hits for me is I know exactly like what he's dealing with. And that's why he's motivated, because you see the later films and you see like, yeah, when he talks about like Gondor is on the brink, we're right next to Sauron. We have to deal with this every day, and we need the ring. Like you get that, but in this movie you don't see that, right? You don't see how close they are and everything until the later films when you're like, oh my god, these guys are just like they're neighbors basically.
Ford or Mordor, yeah.
Yeah.
I must have known this with the Industrial Revolution metaphor, but like, yeah, he's really mean to trees. Saruman's
he
he's
hates
like
trees.
he's like
his
the,
main thing is he doesn't
it's
like
the
trees.
plot of the Lorax, but like, what?
Yeah,
he's really mean to trees. I just now I'm upset about it.
Yeah, the dude hates trees.
Like they really make a point of it. Goblin's like, hey, this tree has really strong roots, and Saruman's like, tear it down.
Yeah, and then he digs a big hole with like a bunch of, I don't know why he needs all the trees and the big hole
to fuel, right? To
Yeah,
like make the orcs.
But
at some point they do say it might be in the Two Towers, but it's either in this one or in the Two Towers. One of the orcs comes to him and is like, "Hey, we don't have like enough fuel for the fires." And Saruman's like, "More trees,
more trees."
I guess it's to make the armor, right? Because I don't think it requires like fuel to create the Uruk-hai, but I think they need to they're forging all the weapons.
Melting.
Yeah,
got it.
Look, in industry, it's bad. On that note, Bennett. So Rebecca has a new book that's out. It's called Babel. And, give us the pitch for Babel.
Babel is great. I won't embarrass her by talking about it too much, but there is Babel. The book is named after a tower in the book called Babel. So if you like the Two Towers, you might also like Babel, which is just like one tower.
I love it. And that's a great pitch.
Like towers.
I love towers. Everybody knows that about me, that I love towers.
Yes.
I love a tower.
And on that note, check out Babel and check out Rebecca's other books, The Poppy War and The Dragon Republic. And Rebecca, Bennett, where can people find you on social media or your website or anything like that?
Sometimes Bennett wakes up in the middle of the night and says, "Here's a tweet. Can I tweet it?" And I say, "No, you can just tell it to me." So you can find me at KuangRF online, and you can find Bennett at _philosophizer on Twitter, but know that most of what he wishes to tell to the world gets preemptively filtered out by me and deleted.
You shall not pass!
Thank you guys very much for being here, and it was a real pleasure. And thank you for bringing your knowledge of not only Lord of the Rings, but fantasy in general, and your love of the books and of the movies. And we are at Cowspod on Twitter. You can find us on the web at cowspod.wordpress.com. You can buy merch at cowspod.threadless.com. And in 2 weeks, we'll be talking about The Two Towers with Agnes Callard and Robin Hanson. So we'll see you then. Thanks, everyone. Bye.